what are the dangers of having a central bank in a society?
So a central bank, especially as it has been set up for your American listeners in the U.S., it's a cartel that is being operated by the banks. And specifically in the case of the Federal Reserve in the United States, it was set up in 1913 as a cartel run by, owned by, operated by the very banks that are supposedly being regulated by this system. But they are, in fact, the Federal Reserve is a weird system of centralized / decentralized control. That's the way they frame it. And there's a board of governors, and they like to have the fig leaf of, oh, the chairman is appointed by the president. So it's kind of this creation of Congress. But as the Federal Reserve says, as Alan Greenspan says, no other agency of government can override any action that we take. We are not beholden to government. And although, yes, I guess there is the sort of the charter that was signed off on by the Congress and had to be renewed every 20 years, but then they got rid of that, and it never has to be renewed ever again. It will keep going until Congress actually abolishes. And the whole thing came about really in 1907. There was this big crash, this panic that took place on Wall Street that may or may not have been precipitated by J.P. Morgan. People who want that story can look into my hour-and-a-half long documentary on the subject, Century of Enslavement, the History of the Federal Reserve. But basically, this panic made people wonder, oh, what will government do about this? Please come in and save us. And so the very banksters that were supposedly going to be regulated and controlled by this new creation of government got together on Jekyll Island off of the coast of Georgia in 1910 to come up with a plan that eventually became essentially the Federal Reserve Act. It went through some permutations. The original plan that they forwarded got exposed as being, hey, this is a bankster plan. So they had to abandon that one and then pass it under another name. But basically, it became the Federal Reserve. And it is a cartel that is these 12 regional banks that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Federal Reserve Bank of Illinois, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, whatever. There are 12 of them scattered across the U.S., but they are private banks. In fact, they've even argued that in court, as they argued over a decade ago when the Federal Reserve was being sued for freedom of information, under freedom of information, for information about the bailout, the billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars in the 2008 bailout, and we want to get more information about that. They were sued over it by, I believe, Bloomberg, and they had to argue in court, hey, we're not a government agency. We're a private bank, so you can't sue us for that information. So that is what this is. It is a cartel. And until people understand that, they won't understand that the entire banking system, including the money creation system as it exists and is functioning now, is almost entirely, almost exclusively, except for the coins in your pocket that are minted by the mint. And I suppose the Treasury supposedly issues the Federal Reserve notes that are in your pocket. But again, that's Federal Reserve imprimatur. That is all of the money that's circulating that has nothing to do with the banks. The rest of it is created out of debt, owed back to the banksters at interest. The government gives them the power to create the money out of debt. And from that system, you have what we see today, which is a system of people being essentially enslaved by debt to the banksters.
So I was going to try to touch on who actually owns the Federal Reserve today. Is that something that we could see, or is it like private?
So as I said, the 12 regional banks that make up the Federal Reserve System are private banks, and they are owned by the banks that themselves are part of that Federal Reserve System. They essentially, the bank holders are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve in that sense, and they do get paid a dividend because the Federal Reserve makes money for creating money for the Treasury. They make money out of that proposition, but don't worry, they send it all back to the Treasury. So they're not. It's not a money-making business. Oh, but they do keep 6% for their dividend for their shareholders, which are the private banks. So there's that aspect of the scam. But the more fundamental aspect of the scam is, I think people get hung up on the word ownership and what that means and shareholders or something like that. But it's more about the power to create money and to direct those flow of funds. That is the power. And whether that power comes from some sort of, ownership deed, or whether that comes from the fact that, our man is at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and he can dictate where hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout money is going. That seems to be more the operative part of it. The real question is who holds the power of the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I guess. And who decides those things? Like, I've heard of the Federal Reserve just giving money to countries and just like
Mhm.
printing money out of nothing. Like who makes those decisions? And I guess
Yeah,
my deeper question was like, who who owns the majority of the wealth? I was gonna mention like families, but I don't know if that's the proper route.
right, of course. And in that regard, of course, people are going to talk about families like the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers. I mean, one thing I've done a lot of work on the Rockefellers. I did my big oil documentary, and I thought it was interesting how the Rockefellers went from oil into banking, and the Rothschilds went from banking into oil. I mean, any way that you can monopolize or carve out a piece of an incredibly important resource like that, whether it be energy or money, obviously it's going to be a draw for vested interests that want to preserve their wealth. And I think there is something to that. And there are the Lazards and other names that certainly have been around for a long time, intergenerationally in the banking world. But I think, again, there's a rotating cast of characters that come in and out of these positions. And I think if people get hung up on the idea that it's all being controlled by a certain family or something along those lines, I think they miss the deeper picture of this, which is, okay, so if that's the case, then we just kill everyone in that family and the world will be all magically better overnight. No, reality does not work that way. It is about an ideology. It is about an ideology of control. People who genuinely believe they deserve to rule over other people, to create money for the benefit of themselves, their families, and their friends. That is the system that we're trying to really topple here, and that's something that has to be done from the conscious perspective. I think we need a conscious revolution in order to not make a system whereby if we take out the people who happen to be sitting in those particular positions of power today, there'd be a million people who would love to step into those positions tomorrow. We have to create the conditions so that those positions, A, don't exist, and B, people don't want to step into those positions of power. Because I genuinely believe the world would not only be sort of better in some sort of moral sense, although I think that too, obviously, but really it would function much, much better for humanity as a whole if we did not have these positions of centralized power. Because as people like Hayek and others have elaborated at great length in the past, people who believe that they can control society and control the actions that people are taking, control their transactions, control their interactions, try to centrally plan everything, are hindering humanity, not helping it. Because the real beauty and wisdom of humanity comes through people pursuing their own ends independently and interacting in whatever way they see fit to create the society that becomes infinitely more complex than any central planner could even comprehend, let alone actually manage. It's extremely easy for us to say, oh, look at all those pigs. They're the ones and they're the problem. But I think people should really need to step back and really interrogate themselves about how much of that ideology they themselves have bought into. I think there's a lot of people who essentially their gripe is, I don't have that power. Man, I wish I had that power, and then I could use the ring of power for good. Of course, everyone feels that temptation, that pull. Oh, if only I could be in charge, or if only the people I like could be in charge, then everything would be so much better. Again, I think this is a really fundamental battle that we have to fight internally, consciously, against even our own tendencies to want to control other people. And again, I think there's many different ways in which we can make that argument. There is the moral argument. There's also a pragmatic argument, because as I say, central planning does not work. You cannot manage human activity, the human flourishing, and have a productive society. You can manage it and have a bunch of automatons that are essentially going to end up devolving into a complete chaos state, but you cannot actively manage humanity. And until we understand that and truly believe it, not just say it, but really understand and believe it at our core, then nothing will change. Because as I say, get rid of the head of the Hydra, there will be 1 million people tomorrow who would be absolutely lusting over those seats of power.